one of the poorest countries in Latin America, and with a history of 189 military coups, Bolivia was also one of the most unstable.
When I was going to college in Texas, first question you'd be asked is, who's the president of Bolivia this week? Second question down the road was, you're from Bolivia. Ah, Bolivia. What's the inflation rate in Bolivia this week? Because we had galloping hyperinflation that destroyed our economic base.
We found that Bolivia was the 7th highest inflation in the history of man.
23,500%. Prices increased by the hour.
The cost of food and clothes kept increasing. Before it was all over, the total inflation averaged 1% every 10 minutes.
7 out of 10 Bolivians live in poverty. The poor people get hurt even more. They see their pockets be eaten away by inflation that is galloping around.
It's like a tiger. Hyperinflation, if you don't kill it, then you only have one bullet. It'll eat you.
The root of the problem was government finances. The government was spending 30 times more than it received in taxes. Across the continent, Latin America's uncompetitive economies had been piling up debt. In the 1970s, a massive hike in world oil prices left foreign banks awash with petrodollars.
So here were the international banks with billions of dollars and nowhere to earn interest on it. They discovered Latin America.
We were offered unreasonable amounts of money. These banks, who are very unwise in their lending policy, came to the happy conclusion that countries don't go broke. It's true, but sometimes they don't pay.
Guess what? One day, these countries could no longer afford to repay their debts.
In 1982, a financial crisis in Mexico triggered a chain reaction that caused the 1980s to be known as Latin America's lost decade.
Bolivia was probably the most severe case of how things had gone wrong in Latin America. For decades, they just printed money. They collected no taxes. If you can't collect taxes, you have to make money up somehow, and so you just printed it.
Bolivia was a basket case. We were considered hopeless. We had help from nobody. We were totally alone. The World Bank had closed its office. The IMF had pulled out its representative. And the American government and other friendly nations wouldn't answer the telephones.
At 29, economist Jeff Sachs had just become one of Harvard's youngest full professors ever.
In 1985, some former students sent me a note asking whether I would be ready to come to a meeting with a group of visiting Bolivians.
The Bolivians had come to Harvard to take part in a seminar on the hyperinflation that was ravaging their country.
I was absolutely fascinated, made a few observations. Somebody in the back of the room piped up and said, "Well, if you think you know what to do, you come to La Paz." When I got to La Paz in July 1985, the inflation rate was about 60,000%. It was an extraordinary and terrifying thing to see, actually. was a society at the edge of the precipice.
Goni's party did win the election, and he became Minister of Planning. He told the president that Bolivia was running out of time.
We told him, you have 90 days before Bolivia's hyperinflation becomes the highest inflation in world history. So he told us, okay, you have 20 days, you have to start working now.
There was a big discussion whether you could stop hyperinflation or inflation period by taking gradual steps. In this, Jeff Sachs was influential. He's had all this gradual stuff that just doesn't work. When it really gets out of control, you got to stop it. Like in medicine, you got to take some radical steps, otherwise your patient is going to die.
To avoid leaks, they worked at home. Every few days, Goni reported to the president.
We said, look, boys, you got one chance. And remember, as Machiavelli says, all the bad news at once, the good news little by little. So he said, get it all done. Shock therapy is get it over, get it done, stop hyperinflation, and then start rebuilding your economy so you achieve growth.
In August 1985, Goni went public with a program called shock therapy.
It caught everybody by surprise. It had great credibility. It was a shock.
Shock therapy spelled the death of dependency theory. Government spending was slashed. Price controls were scrapped. Import tariffs were cut. Government budgets were balanced.
We didn't use highly sophisticated economic theory to deal with hyperinflation. We just used very simple things, such as from now on the government will only spend what it gets. You get 1 peso, spend 1 peso. You get 2 pesos, spend 2 pesos. If we don't have it, we don't spend it. No borrowing from the central bank, and therefore the central bank did not have to print money.
Shock therapy meant that the price of essentials, transport, food, fuel, all shot up. Until then, people had thought that only a military dictatorship like Chile's could impose such tough measures without tearing society apart.
Bolivia may be a small country, but it had a very big impact in terms of kickstarting reform throughout Latin America. In Brazil, a former professor who actually used to teach the dependency theory launched a program of economic reform that looked a lot like shock therapy. Argentina was suffering from 20,000% inflation, and the new president of that country said, you know, we've seen this movie before.
Pro-market reforms could be implemented under a democracy, and we demonstrated that it was possible here in Argentina.
All across Latin America, governments began to sit up and take notice.
I think the Bolivian experience did have influence. The fact that we did it in democracy, we did it without great social violence, had impact on economic thinkers and on politicians.